There's a moment, and most people never get to see one like it, where something happens right in front of you that stops your breath mid-chest. Not dramatic, not loud, plus just still, which the kind of still that makes the world feel smaller and larger at the same time. I saw one of those moments last autumn, and I've been trying to figure out how to talk about it ever since. It was the third week of October, one of those London mornings that can't decide what it wants to be. Pale sun 1 minute, gray drizzle the next, the clouds moving fast and low like they're late for something. I'd TBH come down from Edinburgh for a conference that had ended a day early, which left me with an unexpected Thursday afternoon and no particular plan. My hotel was near St. James's Park. My feet, with the particular stubbornness of feet when you've been sitting in conference rooms for 2 days, carried me toward the palace. Not Buckingham Palace itself, actually, and I ended up walking along the Mall past the tree line toward the Victoria Memorial. The way the light was falling through the plane trees, gold. Flat and, I guess, little sad, the way October light gets, made the whole stretch feel oddly quiet. The tourist season had thinned. You still had visitors, obviously. You always have visitors. But the thick summer crowds were gone, and in their place was this more manageable scatter of people with cameras and maps, and that slightly reverent hush people get around old buildings and old power. I stopped near one of the benches facing the memorial. Not to sit, actually, just stopped. I stood there for a moment with my hands in my pockets. There was a food cart nearby, the smell of roasted chestnuts just starting to drift over, and I remember thinking that October in London always smells like that. Chestnuts and wet stone and distant bus exhaust. It's not a beautiful smell exactly, but it's one of those smells that grabs you somewhere behind the sternum and squeezes gently. A man was sitting on a bench about 12 feet away from me. I, for what it's worth, noticed him the way you notice someone who's very still in a place where most people are moving. He was elderly. Late 70s, maybe pushing 80, though he carried himself in a way that made guessing his age feel complicated. Straight-backed, plus shoulders squared not with tension but with habit, or the way someone sits when a straight spine has simply become their default over decades. He was wearing a dark coat, well kept, a scarf in a muted green-gray tucked neatly at the collar. His hands rested on his knees. He was looking at the palace gates, not at anything specific. Honestly, just looking. There wasn't anything alarming about him, nothing that should have made me keep watching. But I did. I stood there with my chestnut smell and my Thursday afternoon freedom, and I watched this man sit on his bench and look at those gates with an expression I didn't have a word for. It wasn't grief exactly, but it wasn't nothing. He had a small paper bag beside him on the bench, from one of the bakeries along the side streets by the look of it. He hadn't opened it. It just sat there next to him like he'd brought it along but forgotten why. I almost moved on, plus I should have, probably. The conference had wrung me out a bit, and I was in that particular post-event fog where you're present but not quite fully assembled. But something kept my feet where they were. Then a woman sat down next to him. She came from the direction of the gates, not from the public entrance, but from further along the perimeter, the kind of direction that suggested she hadn't arrived through the usual visitor routes. She was accompanied by 2 men who positioned themselves a few discreet paces back, the way security does when it wants to be present without being intrusive. She was dressed quietly, hat, coat. The kind of wardrobe that says, I know how to disappear in public while also being completely unable to disappear in public. She moved like someone who has been watched her entire adult life and has made a kind of peace with it. It took me a moment, longer than I'd like to admit, to understand what I was seeing. I'd seen her in photographs, obviously, and news coverage, the occasional documentary clip. But photographs flatten people, smooth out the particulars. In person, even at 12 feet, even on a gray October morning, there was something different. A quality of attention that seemed to emanate from her, or maybe toward her, The way the two security men angled their bodies almost imperceptibly, the way the older man on the bench straightened slightly when she sat down, not in surprise but in something more like recognition. It was the queen consort, Camilla. She sat beside the old man the way you sit beside someone you know. Not cautiously. Not with the honestly performance of casual that royals sometimes have to deploy in public. She just, sat and said something to him. Plus, something quiet, leaning slightly toward him in the way of someone speaking under the ambient noise of a public space. The "I guess" old man turned to look at her, and for a moment, just a beat, something crossed his face that I couldn't name then and can't name now. Not surprise. Something deeper than surprise, like a door opening in a wall he'd believed was solid. He spoke. Plus, she listened. Was too far away to hear a single word. I want to stop here and say something honest. I know how this sounds. I know the version of this story that gets told badly, the one that gets stretched and sensationalized into something it wasn't. I've seen enough of those written up in comment sections and tabloid-adjacent blogs to know the shape of exaggeration. What I'm telling you is what I actually saw, from where I actually stood. What I knew in those first few minutes was limited. An elderly man on a bench, a woman who turned out to be the queen consort, a quiet conversation that I'd no access to. The particular quality of the silence between two people who seem to be saying something that matters. The rest, for what it's worth, of what I'm about to tell you came later. Pieced together from things I noticed, things I found out afterward, and one brief moment. 3 minutes at most, where the shape of the story opened up just enough for me to see a corner of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, a man with the straight spine and the unopened bakery bag, I'll call him what I eventually found out he was, which is the clearest description a retired member of the household cavalry. He had served, from what I later understood, for somewhere around 35 years. That kind of service doesn't leave you. It settles into the way you hold your body, the way you look at spaces, the way you occupy a bench in front of a building you spent most of your adult life protecting. He had a face that had been out in weather. Not rough, just textured. The kind of face that's been cold a lot, that stood in rain without being allowed to show it minded. His hair was white and cut with a precision that wasn't vain, just correct. The way things were always correct for him, probably. His coat had a small pin on the lapel. I couldn't see what it was from where I stood, but it caught the pale light once, and I noticed it. Later, I'd think about that pin. Plus, think about what it represented, about what it meant to wear it on. A Thursday afternoon on a bench outside the gates of a place you'd given your life to. He hadn't been back, I think, in a while. There was something about the way he looked at the gates that told me that. Not the look of someone returning often, the look of someone who has stayed away for a time, by choice or by the weight of something, and has finally made themselves come back. Camilla TBH had found him there. Or perhaps she'd known he'd be there. That was the impression I got later, though I couldn't tell you how. The way she walked to that bench, with quiet purpose, no hesitation, didn't read like an accidental encounter, and it read like something arranged, or perhaps simply understood between two people who had agreed. In whatever way grief sometimes creates its own arrangements, that this moment needed to happen. She sat. She spoke, I guess, and he answered. And somewhere in that exchange, on a cool October morning with chestnuts roasting and tourists drifting past, and the London clouds doing their restless thing overhead, something that had been held for a long time, held in that straight-backed, precise, correct body, began very quietly to shift. I saw it from 12 feet away, and I still don't have the right word for it. There was a girl nearby, 8 or 9 years old, with a red woolly hat that had a pom-pom so large it wobbled when she walked, who stopped in front of the Victoria Memorial and turned to her father and said, very loudly, "Is the king in there right now?" Her father said something about schedules and flags, and she considered this with the magnificent skepticism of a child who has decided adults explain things wrongly. The exchange broke the sealed quality of my attention for a moment. I smiled, actually, without meaning to. Looked away from the bench. When I looked back, the old man was doing something I hadn't expected. He was crying. Not dramatically, and not in the way people cry in films, with the full face and the sounds. In the way old soldiers cry, I think, when they finally allow themselves to, contained, almost invisible, just the jaw working slightly, eyes brighter than they should be, and one hand lifting very briefly to press against his mouth before returning to his knee. Camilla had put her hand over his. Her hand over his. And on his knee. And she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the gates. The same gates he'd been looking at when she arrived, as if they, were looking at the same thing together. As if the thing they were both looking at was the same and needed no further identification. The two security men remained where they were. Nobody moved. Nobody intervened. The girl with the red pom-pom hat moved on with her father toward the gift shop. The chestnuts kept roasting, which the London clouds kept traveling their fast, low route across the pale sky. And on that bench, something passed between a queen consort and an old man with 35 years of service in his spine that I can only describe as real. In my opinion, unperformed. The kind of thing that happens in private but was happening somehow in the middle of everything. I stayed another few minutes, which I don't know why. I should have moved on. I'd no reason to be there and every reason to feel like an intruder on something that wasn't mine. But I stayed, and then, this is the part I've turned over the most. The old man said something. Clear enough or loud enough or the wind shifted or I drifted a few feet without noticing. One sentence, which I heard it the way you hear something that wasn't meant for you, half-formed, the words present but barely. She told me to take care of the ones who come after. That was it. That was all I caught. The old man's voice was low, and the words were shaped by a lifetime of not saying things aloud, and I got that one sentence and nothing else. Camilla didn't respond immediately. She sat with those words for a moment, the way you sit with something true that you already knew but needed to hear from the outside. Then she nodded, just once, her hand still over his, and I walked away after that. Felt I'd been given something I hadn't earned the right to witness for much longer, and the decent thing was to leave before I took more than my share of it. I walked back through St. James's Park. The pelicans were out on the lake. Those strange, ancient-looking birds that have been in that park since the 1600s and look perpetually unimpressed by everything London has been up to since then. I stood by the water for a little while and looked at them and tried to figure out what I'd just seen. A retired guard, a queen consort, at which a sentence about taking care of, the ones who come after. And underneath all of it, underneath the crisp October air and the pale London sun, and the quiet formality of two people sitting side by side on a public bench, the unmistakable presence of a woman who was no longer there. Her absence had a shape on that bench, took up space. You could feel where she had been in the way both of them were sitting. I thought about that the rest of the evening. Thought about it through dinner and the walk back to my hotel and the hour before sleep when thoughts do their most persistent work. What basically does it mean to serve something for 35 years? What do you do with yourself when the person at the center of that service is gone? And what did she tell him? The Queen? That in those final days or weeks or whatever the timeline was, that he'd carried all this time, that had brought him to that bench on a cold October Thursday with an unopened bag of pastries and eyes that had been holding something back for over a year? Take care of the ones who come after. I kept hearing it, keep hearing it honestly, like an instruction, and like a charge, like something passed from one generation's hands into another's while there was still time. I didn't go looking for more. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I didn't go, I think, digging through records or make calls or try to find the man's name through some chain of connections. That felt wrong. What I'd seen on that bench wasn't mine to investigate. It actually was mine to carry carefully. And the way you carry something fragile, not gripping too hard, not showing it around. But London in October has a way of folding things back toward each other. 2 days after I saw them on the bench, the conference organizer, a pleasant, slightly frantic woman named Helen, who runs these events with the focused energy of someone who secretly suspects that if she ever stops moving, the whole enterprise will collapse, took a small group of us to dinner near Victoria, a thank you dinner. Good look, wine, too warm restaurant, the kind of evening where the conversation loosens gradually and people start saying more than they'd planned to. There were 7 of us at the table. I was seated next to a man named Richard who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent time in uniform, not showy about it, just present in a certain way. And he was TBH, there for the conference in a private security capacity. One of the presenters had required it. And now that the professional obligation was over, he was relaxed in the way that people who are professionally tense tend to get when the job is done. Expansive, which willing to talk. We got through the starter and most of the first bottle before the conversation reached the palace, the way conversations in London often do, the way gravity works. Someone mentioned the anniversary of the Queen's passing. It had been just over a year, and the city still had that quality of adjusting, like a body learning to stand differently after something has shifted in the spine. Richard went well, quiet in a way that wasn't discomfort exactly, more like consideration. "I'd a colleague," he said. Not to the table, more to the middle distance above his wine glass. Served a long time, proper long. He was on protection detail in the last years. Honestly, not the inner circle, but close enough that the rhythms of that household were just his life. You understand, not a job after a while, just life. Nobody said anything. The table had done that thing tables do sometimes when someone starts saying something true. It just quieted, without anyone choosing to quiet it. "He retired about 8 months before she died," Richard continued. "Health thing, which nothing terrible, but enough that the physicals didn't pass the way they needed to. He was devastated. Not about the health, he could manage that. About leaving, he'd been preparing for a normal retirement, you know, the speeches and the handshake and the gradual wind down. I wasn't ready pretty much for it to be abrupt." He picked up his wine glass and turned it slightly in his fingers, the way people handle things when they're deciding how much to say next. He went to see her, which before he left. Proper goodbye, proper audience. She didn't let long-serving staff simply disappear without a personal farewell. That was her. That was always her. He paused. She said something to him in that meeting that he never told anyone about. Not his wife, not his children, not me, and we'd been close. Close as men like that get, which is to say close enough to read each other without much talking, but not close enough to spill the real things. He kept it. "Kept it how?" someone across the table asked. "In the way quiet men keep things," Richard said, "which is to say completely, like a stone in a coat pocket. You'd forget it was there except when the coat gets heavy." The table absorbed this. "Did he ever say anything about it?" I asked. "After she passed?" Richard looked at me for a moment. There was a brief recalibration in his expression, the slight adjustment of someone recognizing that the person asking has some reason for asking beyond simple curiosity. "Not to me," he said. "He went quite internal after. Basically, lot of them did, the long-serving ones. The grief was particular. Plus, not like, for what it's worth, ordinary grief. Something more complicated. Because your entire professional identity is tied to someone, and then that someone is gone, And the institution carries on, which it must, but the specific person, he trailed off, searched for something, came back with, the specific person was the point. For him, I mean, she was the point. I turned my wine glass. You said he never told anyone what she said to him. Do you think he ever will? Richard considered this for a long time. Long enough that Helen, sensing the conversation had gone somewhere unexpected, therefore interesting, had the social grace to let it sit without filling the space with cheerful redirection. I think, Richard said finally, that when the time comes, and I don't mean that morbidly, I mean the right time, when the holding well of it becomes heavier than the sharing of it, I think he'll say it to exactly the right person, and then it'll have done what it was meant to do. He took a drink of his wine. She was good at that, apparently, at saying things that found the right home. The thing is, I slept badly that night. Not anxious. Exactly. More like activated. To be fair, particular sleeplessness that comes when your brain has connected two pieces of something and is running the connection over and over like a needle finding a groove. The man on the bench, and Richard's colleague. The audience before the retirement, the kept thing, stone-heavy, in a coat pocket. I didn't know they were the same person. I still don't know with certainty. London is full of long-serving retired protection officers, and I'd be foolish to collapse them into one just because the timing fit and the texture matched. But there sort of are coincidences that feel arithmetically possible, and there are coincidences that feel like the universe is following its own logic just out of your sight line. This one felt you. No, like the second kind. I extended my stay by a day, and which I told myself it was the conference follow-up, the networking, the always reasonable excuse of just one more London evening before the train back to Edinburgh. But I walked back to the mall the next morning, not with any plan, just walked. The bench was empty. Of course it was. I stood near it for a while anyway, watched the gates, tried to understand what it would mean to have stood in front of those gates day after day, year after year, with the weight of protection around your shoulders, not just physical protection but something older and more ceremonial, the kind of witnessing that becomes its own form of devotion. And basically, then to be called in, to stand before the woman you'd spent decades protecting, to be told something in a private room that she wanted only you to carry. What do you, in my opinion, to do with something like that? You sit on a bench, I suppose, on a cold October morning, with, in my opinion, an unopened bag of pastries and eyes that have been holding something back for over a year. And you wait, maybe not even knowing you're waiting, for the right person to come and sit beside you. There are things I looked up later, not about him, namely, about the nature of what those long relationships are between the monarch and the household staff who serve for decades. The ones who see things no public record captures. The early mornings, the private rooms, the offhand moments in corridors between formal occasions. There are accounts from various former staff, scattered through biographies and occasional interviews, describing a woman who remembered. She who asked about your children by name 3 years after you'd mentioned them once. Who sent handwritten notes for things that didn't require handwritten notes. Who had a way, particular, unrepeatable, of making the people around her feel that they were seen. Not as staff, as people. That's not a small thing. Over 35 years, that's not a small thing at all. I thought about what Richard said. The specific person, basically, was the point. And I thought about how grief is different when the person was that kind of specific. When they weren't an abstraction or a symbol, though they were also those things, but first and before all of it, a person who knew your face. Who paused in a corridor and asked how your knee was healing. Who remembered the name of your dog. Plus, when that person goes, the grief has a face, has a voice. Has the specific texture of 35 years of small recognitions. I was on my way to the train station, Edinburgh, early afternoon departure, finally allowing myself to leave, when I stopped for a coffee near St. James's. Small cafe, the steamed-up windows and newspapers, and the efficient, slightly weary warmth of a London cafe in October. The man from the bench was at a table near the window. To be fair, alone this time. The bakery bag, or a new one just like it, open in front of him, a cup of tea at his elbow. He was reading something on a phone with the squinting concentration of someone who has recently been handed reading glasses and isn't fully reconciled to them. I ordered my coffee, waited for it, stood with my bag over my shoulder, and the entirely reasonable thing to do was to take my coffee, leave. I'd go to the station, go home. I went to his table instead. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was near the Victoria Memorial 2 days ago. I wasn't trying to overhear, but I caught a fragment of something you said, and I've been carrying it since, and I thought if I saw you again it was probably for a reason." He looked at me. His eyes, up close, pale gray with that particular sharpness that old soldiers seem to retain even when everything else has worn smooth, were neither hostile nor welcoming, just assessing. He had a lot of practice assessing people, probably. "Sit," he said, not warmly, but without objection. I sat. "What did you hear?" he asked. "TBH," I told him. "Exactly what I'd told you. She told me to take care of the ones who come after." He looked at me for a long moment, and his hands were folded on the table, which the tea steamed gently. The cafe noise moved around us. "That's the half you can repeat," he said at last. "I suspected there was more. There's always more." He looked out the window. The street was doing its ordinary London thing. Buses, bicycles, a woman with a pushchair, 2 tourists studying a paper map with matching expressions of cheerful helplessness. The part you can repeat is the part that was for the institution. The other part was for me. "You don't have to tell me." "I know I don't." He picked up his tea, held it, set it down without drinking. "She kind of knew she was declining. That autumn, the last one. She knew the way people know when they've been honest with themselves long enough. She called in a few of us, and not formally, just called us in." He stopped. At the window, the buses, the tourists with their paper map. "She said she was sorry," he said, "which, for the weight of it, for what that kind of service costs. She said she'd watched us, watched all of us who'd given that much time, and she knew we didn't always talk about what it cost. She said that was the deal. She understood, that was the job. But she wanted to say, before she couldn't anymore, that she saw it, that she knew what we'd given, that it mattered." The cafe was warm. Someone's phone played like 2 bars of something before being silenced. "And I guess," she said, "she made it personal. She said to me, specifically by name, she said, 'You stayed when you didn't have to, more than once. I want you to know I know that.'" He was quiet. "I didn't know she knew that," he said. I'd thought, you think these things pass unobserved, the small choices, the extra shifts, the extended postings when someone else had to leave, the times you don't put in for the recognition because it doesn't feel right to. You basically think you're invisible in those moments," she noticed. He lifted his tea and finally drank. "The taking care of the ones who come after, that was instruction. She said the institution would need people who remembered what it was supposed to be, who remembered the human part, not just the ceremonial part. She said the ones who understood that were the ones she was counting on to carry it forward." I sat with that. "And then the woman from the bench," I said carefully. "The queen consort. She knew?" He nodded, just barely. "She was there for some of it. Different conversation, different day, but she knew what had been said. She'd heard enough to understand what I was carrying." He turned back to the window. "She came to check that I was standing up all right, I suppose. Under it." "Are you?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Because the answer was in the way he was sitting. Straight-backed, coat neat, pin on the lapel catching the pale October light through the steamed window. For what it's worth, present. Carrying it, and TBH, still standing. He let, honestly, me sit for about 10 more minutes. We didn't say pretty much, very much. He finished his tea, which I finished my coffee. He asked where I was from, and I told him, and he said he'd been to Edinburgh twice. Liked it both times, but found the castle a bit too aggressively vertical. I laughed at that. He smiled for what it's worth. Just slightly. But genuinely the way people smile when they've said something they intended to be funny. She had a word she used, he said, as I was gathering my bag. When she was pleased with someone's service, when she wanted to convey, not just thank you, but something more than that, she'd say, steady. He looked at me, and just that, steady, plus, one word. You'd know what it meant. I stood up, extended my hand. He shook it, firm, brief, the kind of handshake that means what it says. Thank you, I said. Steady, he said. I mean, quietly, like he was passing something along. The train back to Edinburgh takes about 4.5 hours if everything cooperates, which on this particular Friday it didn't, which gave me an extra 40 minutes sitting at York Station watching the platform and turning everything over in my mind. I'm a, fairly practical person. Plus, I've spent basically most of my professional life in research environments where the premium is on what can be verified, sourced, quantified. I'm not prone to mysticism, which I don't look for signs in coincidences. I tend to find meaning in structure rather than in the unstructured events that seem to announce themselves as meaningful. So I want to be clear about what I'm not claiming. I'm not honestly claiming that what I witnessed over those 3 days in October was some extraordinary intervention of fate. I'm not claiming the man on the bench was chosen or special in a way that diminishes everyone else who served with equal dedication and kept their own private words in their own private coat pockets. I'm TBH. I'm not claiming any particular insight into a family or an institution that I observed only briefly, from the outside, through the condensation on a cafe window. What I'm claiming is simpler and also, I think, larger. I saw something real, and real things are hard to come by. There's a version of this story that could be told with different architecture, the sensational version, the version that emphasizes the stunned expression and the revelation and the dramatic weight of royal secrets being disclosed to a stranger in a cafe. That version would be easy to write and would probably find a larger audience and would be, in the ways that matter, false. What I actually saw was 2 people sitting next to each other on a bench in the cold. What I actually heard was one man, in a warm cafe, telling a stranger about the moment someone he'd served had looked at him and said simply, "I know what you gave. I see you. That's the whole of it. And somehow, the whole of it's enormous." I've thought since then about the particular weight of being witnessed by someone in authority, not fame. Authority, which is different and older. The kind of authority that carries long tenure and accumulated trust and the responsibility of representing something beyond itself. When a person like that looks at you and says, "I see what it cost you. I want you to know that I know," that's not a small thing. That's not a for what it's worth, routine kindness, that lands somewhere beneath the ribcage and it stays. The man I spoke to had been carrying it for over a year. Not because it was a burden, I think, because it was precious. Because the carrying of it was itself a form of continued service. To the memory, to the instruction, to the charge she'd given him. Take care of the ones who come after. I keep coming back to that. Which the simplicity of it, the completeness of it. Plus, a woman who had spent her entire adult life as a symbol of service, asking, at the end of things, the person in front of her to carry it forward. Not the pageantry, not the institution in its vast formal architecture. The human part of it, which the part that lives in the corridor conversations and the remembered names and the small choices nobody sees, but someone always notices. That was what she was asking him to keep alive. Pretty much, and he was. There's one more thing I want to tell you. This is the part I've deliberated most about including, not because it's the most personal and the most interior, and therefore the most likely to be misread. But I think it belongs here, because I think it's the part that explains why I've been trying to tell this story at all. On the train, the delayed one, the one, sitting at York while the platform pigeons went about their ruthless pigeon business, I called my father. Well, he's 74. He worked for 30 years as a civil servant in a government department I won't name because it would identify him in ways he wouldn't choose. He wasn't a royal guard. He wasn't in the military. His service was in gray offices with fluorescent lighting, not in ceremonial uniform on the mall. But he gave 30 years to something, and when he retired, it was also somewhat abrupt, a restructuring, a redundancy package. At the kind of exit that doesn't come with speeches and handshakes, but with a form letter and a date. He took it well, publicly, which he's that generation. You take things well publicly. We don't talk enough. I know this, and I keep intending to correct it, and life does its life thing, and the weeks go by. He picked up on the third ring, slightly out of breath in the way he always is when he answers the phone, as if he sprints to it regardless of where he's in the house. Hello? Dad, it's me. Do you have a minute? Of course. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, I said. I just wanted to call. Tell you some things I've been thinking about. A pause. Not long, but present. All right, he said, and his voice shifted slightly. The way voices shift when the call isn't about logistics. When it's about something else entirely. I'm listening. And I told him about the bench and the cafe and the man with the straight spine and the pale gray eyes and the pin on his lapel. I told him about Camilla's hand over the old guard's hand, and both of them looking at the gates, and the quality of silence that existed between two people who were grieving the same specific absence. I told him what the man had said about being seen, about the private audience and the words that had landed beneath the rib cage and stayed. My father listened without interrupting, and he's good at that. When I finished, neither of us said anything for a moment. The York platform pigeons waddled past a discarded sandwich. The departure board cycled. Plus, I guess, he was right to keep it, my father said eventually. Something like that. You keep it. Not because it's a secret, because it needs to be held properly. Were you ever... I stopped. Started again. Was there ever a moment like that in your career? Someone who said something that you held on to? Another pause. Actually, longer this time. Once, he said. Plus, my division head, when I was about 15 years in. She was kind of moving departments, and she called me in, just me, and she said... He trailed off, and I could hear him in his kitchen, sitting probably at the table where he sits when he's on the phone, looking probably at the garden where the light would be going in the late afternoon. She said, you do this because you believe in it, and not everybody does, and it shows, and I want you to know I noticed. The train started moving. I've never told your mother that, he said. Not sure why, it just felt like mine. It is yours, I said. That's exactly right. We talked for another hour, long past York, pretty much, through the green and gray countryside rolling north, past the Northumberland coast where the sea appeared in brief, bright flashes between the hills. We talked about his years in service, about the cases that had mattered to him and the ones. That kept him up at night, and the small wins that nobody ever reported, because small wins don't make news, but they make lives. We talked about my grandmother, who had died 3 years ago, and whom he still missed in ways he rarely named directly. We talked like sort of people who have been meaning to talk and finally found the excuse. When I got home to Edinburgh, I made a cup of tea. the proper way. I'd not in a hurry, the way my grandmother taught me. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the word the retired guard had given me at the end of our conversation. Basically, steady. One word. I thought about what it meant to give that word to someone, to say, you, I think, are upright, you are present, you are carrying what you're carrying, and you're still standing. And I see it. I thought about how rarely we say that to each other. Not the big declarations, the anniversaries, and the formal recognitions and the speeches. Those are important, but they're also, in some way, expected. They're in the protocol. They show up in the calendar. The thing that lands beneath the ribcage is the unprompted one. The one that comes when there's no occasion for it. Honestly, the corridor moment. I'm the private room, the bench in October with the chestnuts roasting and the cold light falling through the trees. Steady. You're doing it. I see you. Keep going. I don't know the retired guard's name. I didn't ask and he didn't offer it, and the arrangement felt right. Some people you meet briefly and carry unnamed, they belong to the story, not the archive. I know his shape, the coat, the pin, the way he sat on that bench like a man made of habit and quiet dedication. The look, eyes that were pale and sharp and had been holding something for over a year. The small, real smile when he made his joke about Edinburgh's aggressively vertical castle. I think, what he was given, in a private room, by a woman who understood the weight of what she was asking people to carry for her, and who wanted them to know, before it was too late to tell them, that she knew it wasn't nothing. And I know what he passed on to me across a cafe table in October, in the way that things of that kind sometimes find their way forward. Not because I deserved it, not because there was any particular design, just because I sat down. Just because he said steady and I heard it. The bench near the Victoria Memorial is still there, I assume. The plane trees on the mall lose their leaves in October and stand bare through winter and bud again in spring, as they've done for centuries. The gates open and close, the guards change, the palace carries on as institutions do. Imperfect, necessary, draped in meaning that outlasts any single person who holds it. And in a quiet way that hasn't thing to do with headlines or ceremony or the formal record of anything, a retired man with 35 years in his spine is doing what he was asked to do, taking care of the ones who come after, being steady and passing it on, in whatever form it takes, a word, a sentence, a hand over another person's hand on a bench on a cold October morning, to whoever is paying enough attention to receive it. I called my father again last week, just to talk. Plus, he picked up on the second ring this time, less breathless. I was pretty much hoping it might be you, he said. That's the whole of it. That's also, I think, everything.